I never thought I'd be sitting here, telling this story. It's the kind of thing you believe could never happen to you until it does. Life has a way of unraveling in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes, a single moment can change everything. What I'm about to share isn't just a story, it's a wound. One that hasn't healed, no matter how much time has passed. There are choices you make, things you experience, that stay with you forever. And sometimes, it's not the big, obvious events that leave the deepest marks, it's the quiet, fleeting moments you never see coming. It started with something so small, so ordinary, that I didn't realize what it meant at the time. But looking back now, I see how it was the beginning of everything. That moment, it's burned into my mind. I've replayed it over and over, wishing I could go back, stop it, change it. But I can't. What followed is something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. It's a story of regret, of lines that should never be crossed, of consequences I couldn't escape. And yet, it all began with one moment, one decision, that seemed so insignificant at the time. If I had known then what I know now, maybe things would have been different. Maybe I could have stopped what was coming. But I didn't. And now, there's no going back. When I married my husband, I knew I'd have to adjust to more than just being a wife. I was stepping into the role of a stepmother, a title I didn't take lightly but one I wasn't entirely prepared for either. Jason, my husband's teenage son, wasn't thrilled about me being there. He was moody, distant, and carried an air of resentment that I initially chalked up to the usual teenage angst. My husband, bless him, tried to make the transition as smooth as possible, but he was often away, long hours at work, business trips, the kind of absences you get used to in a marriage. That left Jason and me alone more than I expected. And though I tried to bridge the gap, Jason kept me at arm's length. He rarely spoke to me, wouldn't even meet my eyes half the time. At first, I let it go, thinking he just needed space. But slowly, something shifted. It wasn't anything obvious, just small changes that I barely noticed at first. He started staying in the same room a little longer when we were alone, making brief comments where there had only been silence before. I thought we were making progress, finally finding common ground. I was relieved, maybe even proud of myself for reaching him. But as I look back now, I can't help but wonder if I missed the signs, if there was something else happening beneath the surface that I failed to see. It was an evening like any other, or so I thought. The house was quiet, with my husband away on one of his frequent work trips. Jason was in his room, the door closed as always, lost in his own world. I didn't think much of it, we had settled into a routine of existing alongside each other, not quite close but no longer strangers either. I was in my bedroom, standing by the wardrobe, sorting through a pile of clothes. The day had been uneventful, and I was looking forward to winding down. I started to change, absent-mindedly moving through the motions of my evening. The door to my room was pushed just enough to make me believe it was shut. I didn't think twice about it. Until I heard the soft creak. I turned instinctively, and there he was, Jason, standing in the doorway. His expression froze me in place. It wasn't just shock, it was layered, almost unreadable. His eyes locked onto mine, wide and uncertain, and for what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. I wanted to say something, to break the moment, but the words wouldn't come. My mind raced. Should I cover myself? Should I yell? But I did nothing. My feet felt glued to the ground, my breath caught somewhere in my chest. And then, as quickly as it had happened, Jason turned and left, his footsteps disappearing down the hall. He didn't close the door behind him. I stood there, staring at the empty doorway, trying to process what had just happened. It should have been a simple accident, an awkward but harmless encounter that would fade with time. But it didn't feel harmless. It felt charged. Something unspoken lingered in the air, and no matter how much I tried to shake it off, I couldn't. The days after were different. Jason barely spoke to me, which wasn't unusual, but this silence carried a weight it hadn't before. He avoided me entirely, slipping out of rooms if I entered and keeping his eyes averted during the rare moments we crossed paths. And yet, even with the avoidance, I could feel a shift. It was subtle but undeniable, a tension that seemed to grow stronger every time we were in the same space. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into an innocent moment. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had changed. Something I couldn't name, couldn't fully grasp, but it was there, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. And as much as I wanted to pretend it didn't exist, I couldn't escape the feeling that the line between what was and what shouldn't be had started to blur. After that day, everything between Jason and me changed, but it wasn't immediate. It didn't happen with a bang or a confrontation. Instead, it was more like a slow pull, a subtle shift that I didn't know how to navigate. At first, I thought it would all blow over. Maybe it was just an awkward moment, something we would both forget. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something neither of us could undo. Jason started finding reasons to be around me. It wasn't obvious at first, but the more time passed, the more I noticed it. At random moments, he'd linger in the kitchen when I was preparing dinner, his presence a little too close, a little too steady. He would stand in the doorway while I worked on my computer, just watching me without saying much. There was an intensity in his gaze, like he was searching for something, answers, connection, or maybe just validation. And every time our eyes met, there was a brief flicker of something unspoken, something that didn't feel right. But I never said anything. I didn't stop him. The first time he initiated a conversation after the incident, I should have pulled back. He came to me, leaning against the doorframe, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "What's for dinner tonight?" he asked casually, but his voice was low, more intimate than I expected. I gave him a brief answer, trying to keep the conversation light, but as he lingered, I could feel the weight of his presence. He wasn't just talking to me, he was watching me, his eyes lingering just a moment longer than they should have. And when our eyes met, I felt something tighten in my chest, something I couldn't explain. I told myself it was nothing. Just teenage behavior, right? He was probably bored. Or maybe he was just looking for a little attention, some sense of comfort in the awkwardness between us. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. There was a part of me, however small, that enjoyed the attention. And I hated myself for it. I started to catch myself waiting for those moments when Jason would appear, when our paths would cross. It wasn't like I was actively seeking him out, but there was an undeniable part of me that felt a strange pull every time he was near. He would find reasons to talk to me, questions about the simplest things, like how my day was going or what I was watching on TV. They were just conversations, normal interactions, but there was something about them that felt too personal. Too familiar. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me, the small gestures, like brushing past me when he entered the room, his shoulder lingering just a second too long against mine. It wasn't malicious, but it felt like something I should have stopped. And yet, I didn't. Each time, I told myself it was harmless. He was just a teenager, trying to find his place in the world. He had his own struggles, his own issues, and maybe he was looking for a connection that he didn't know how to express. But in the quiet moments when we were alone, when the silence stretched between us, I knew the truth was far more complicated. I knew I should be pulling back, should be setting boundaries. But there was a part of me that didn't want to. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that as long as nothing overt happened, as long as I didn't let it cross any obvious lines, it would be fine. But the truth was, I was walking a dangerous path. I could feel it in my gut, that small voice whispering that I was already too far gone. There were nights when I couldn't sleep, my thoughts racing over what had happened and what was happening. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, the guilt eating away at me, mixing with a strange sense of excitement I couldn't explain. Every time Jason found a reason to be near me, to talk to me, to linger just a little too long, I felt something stir in me, something I didn't want to acknowledge. I knew it was wrong. There was no denying that. But it was as if I was trapped in a web I didn't know how to escape from. I wanted to stop it, but part of me didn't. I kept telling myself that it was just a phase, that I could ignore it, that we could both move past it. But every time Jason's eyes met mine, every time he stayed just a little too close, I couldn't pretend it was nothing. And the more I tried to convince myself that I was in control, the more I realized I wasn't. The guilt gnawed at me every time I caught myself looking for him, every time I didn't stop it when I should have. I had crossed a line I hadn't meant to cross, and now it felt like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't undo. And the worst part? A small, terrible part of me didn't know if I even wanted to. The tension between Jason and me had been building for weeks, but I didn't realize how far it had gone until one night, when everything changed. It was a quiet evening. The house was still, with only the soft hum of the TV filling the space. Jason had been around more than usual lately, lingering in the kitchen, sitting close during meals, and standing in doorways. It wasn't anything overt, just small, unspoken moments. But on this night, I could feel it. The air felt charged, like something was about to happen, something I couldn't stop. I was on the couch, trying to lose myself in a show, when Jason appeared in the doorway. His presence was different, there was a weight to it. "Can I sit?" he asked in a voice lower than usual. I nodded, barely able to speak. He crossed the room slowly and sat down beside me, close, too close. His body was warm, and I could feel the heat of him against me, a closeness that felt strange and wrong. His gaze, always intense, was now locked on me with a heaviness that made my heart race. We began to talk, but it wasn't like before. It felt like the words were just a distraction from the tension building between us. His hand brushed against mine as he shifted, the touch lingering a second too long. I could feel the hairs on my neck stand up, my breath quickening. When he leaned in, just slightly, his lips so close to my ear, I froze. "I don't know why I feel this way about you," he whispered, his words a dangerous secret. "But I can't stop it." The moment hung in the air. I should have pulled away, stopped it, but I didn't. Instead, I sat there, frozen, my body betraying me. Guilt flooded me, but so did something else, something dark I didn't want to acknowledge. When he finally pulled back, I felt sick, sick to my stomach, like I had betrayed not just my husband but myself. I couldn't undo what had just happened. I wanted to scream, to run, but instead, I sat there, unable to move, trapped in a moment that would haunt me forever. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. And the worst part? A small part of me didn't want to. The days after that night felt like living in a haze. Jason withdrew again, but this time, it was different. His usual moodiness turned into cold, deliberate silence. He stopped seeking my company, and when we passed each other, there was an awkwardness, a tension that was impossible to ignore. It was as if we both knew something had changed but couldn't find the words to address it. I tried to convince myself that everything would return to normal, that time would heal the rift. But the distance between Jason and me only grew, and eventually, my husband noticed. He wasn't blind to the shift in the air. My husband had always been loving, but now, he saw the subtle changes, how Jason avoided looking at me, how conversations felt strained. It wasn't long before he asked the one question I dreaded. "What's going on?" he asked one evening, his voice low and filled with concern. "Why does it feel like something's off between us?" I had no answer, no excuse that could justify the growing distance. My heart raced as I tried to come up with something, anything, but the truth was closing in, and I couldn't outrun it. Then, it all came crashing down. Jason's behavior became too much for my husband to ignore, and the truth spilled out. The details, the pain, everything that had been hidden was laid bare. My husband's face changed in an instant, the shock, the disbelief, and then, the hurt. That look, one of betrayal, was something I could never forget. I tried to explain, to apologize, but the words felt meaningless. The damage was done, and nothing could undo it. The consequences were immediate. My husband withdrew, consumed by the pain of betrayal. Our marriage, the life we had built, crumbled in a matter of days. It wasn't just our relationship, it was everything. The trust we had worked so hard to nurture was destroyed. Our family, the one we had hoped to create, was fractured beyond repair. There were no more shared meals, no more laughter filling the house. It felt like we were strangers now, living in the ruins of what had once been a family. When my husband left, I felt the weight of everything we had lost. The dreams we had for our future were shattered, and I knew the consequences of that one night would follow me forever. The days that followed were a blur of guilt and regret. I live with the weight of what happened every single day. It's a burden that doesn't go away, no matter how hard I try to bury it or convince myself that time will heal the wounds. I lost everything because I let my emotions cloud my judgment, because I let myself fall into a place I never should have gone. I thought I could control it, that it was just a fleeting moment. But it wasn't. It was a choice I made, and now I have to live with the consequences. Every morning, I wake up and feel the absence of what used to be. The emptiness of an empty house, the silence where laughter and love once lived, and the cold truth that I destroyed it all. My husband, the man I swore to love and cherish, is gone. The family I thought we were building is broken. And Jason, he's a shadow of the boy he once was, the weight of the betrayal hanging over him too. I've learned the hard way that some lines should never be crossed. There are moments in life where emotions blur the lines of what's right and wrong, where desire makes you forget everything you stand for. But the price is too high. It's not just about one moment of weakness, it's about what that moment does to you, to everyone around you. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that once a line is crossed, you can never go back. No apology, no explanation can erase the damage. And no matter how much you wish you could turn back time, you can't. The consequences will always follow you, whether you want them to or not. So, to anyone listening, if you ever find yourself at a crossroads like I did, take a step back. Think carefully. The cost of crossing certain lines is more than you can ever imagine. This story isn't easy for me to share. It's raw, painful, and filled with regret. But if telling it can stop even one person from making the same mistake, then it's worth it. No one should have to go through what I've been through, the destruction, the guilt, the loss. I've learned the hard way that the cost of a momentary lapse in judgment is far more than I ever could have imagined. If you're watching this, I hope my experience serves as a warning. Trust me when I say that the consequences of crossing certain boundaries are irreversible. If you can take anything from this story, let it be the reminder that some lines should never be crossed. What would you have done in my shoes? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Would you have handled it differently? Let me know in the comments below. I really want to hear from you. And, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe. I'll be sharing more real-life stories that can help us all learn from each other's mistakes and grow. Thank you for listening to mine.